want to do? It's 6:02. We should probably rock and roll, right?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
It's nice to see everybody. But I am personally, because she is a dear, dear friend of mine of almost over 20 years now, and such an impactful, engaged member of the nonprofit community and working to advance women, children, and families, and a really dedicated member of WLP. I'm just super thrilled that we had the opportunity, and in her very busy schedule, our friend Mindy Murphy agreed to present on her very interesting trajectory and path to her life's mission. I think her work with the Spring of Tampa Bay, and the amazing change that she's helping create for our communities. I don't want to eat up her time. I'm gonna give it to Jessica. And she is going to get us started. But thank you on behalf of WLP, Mindy, and of the women in our community. Thank you for everything that you do.
You're welcome. Thank you, India.
Love you.
All right, just to go over some housekeeping logistics of using this program, since it is a little different than using either Microsoft Teams Live, which we have used in the past weeks, or using Zoom. But we would like to open up the chat feature for any questions. So throughout the evening, if you have any questions, please either place them in there, or there's a new feature called raising your hand, which is similar to like a Zoom call. So if you want to raise your hand, which is, at least in my view, if you roll your mouse over the screen, there's a little hand that looks just like that. So just click on that. I will be able to see it pop up. So if you have a question, I will call on you. And that, I think, is about it. But I'm going to pitch it over to Mindy. Thank you so much for being here. And here we go.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not a Microsoft Teams person. I'm all in for Zoom. And my view, I can literally only see one person. So I am going to actually be speaking to my computer screen without really being able to see you all. So I can't even see who's in the room. So my apologies. I'm also going to tell you that it's going to be a little bit more of me. I prepared remarks for the first 7 or so minutes because it's where I'm not in my comfort zone. And then I'm going to pivot to talking about the spring specifically, where I could just talk for hours and days. So that'll be a little bit more off the cuff. This is going to be a little more canned. So here we go. And since it's a leadership series, you know, what I thought I would do is I would do my best today to weave my personal leadership observations as I tell you my story, which India alluded to. It's not really all that exciting, but talk about the Spring of Tampa Bay and talk about domestic violence and some ways in which you can be of help to survivors in our community. But I'm going to give you my very first leadership observation, and it's this. Leadership takes courage, and courage does not equate to the absence of fear. It means finding within yourself the stamina to move forward through your fear. And I tell you this because I am 100% comfortable going into a room of 5 people or 5,000 people to talk about the Spring of Tampa Bay. I stand at a podium with the best of them, but when I actually have to talk about myself and my leadership journey, I'm literally a touch terrified, and I think that's a word I'm going to probably use 3 or 4 times in this presentation, because talking about leadership and presenting myself in any way as an expert on all that word encompasses is a little bit it's just a little bit unsettling for me. So hopefully I will do the leadership series justice. So I'm going to practice courage today. I grew up in a household was born in Germany, moved to Kansas City, and then eventually settled in Cincinnati until I went to college in Virginia. And I grew up in a household with an underlying belief that, like many of you, I'm not quoting anything that anyone hasn't heard 100 times, that to whom much is given, much is expected. And I really think that that's an easy thing to say when life has given you a lot of blessings, like it has me. But what I found in my 52 years of life on Earth is that I can now say that I'm really, truly amazed at how many girls and women, including all of our WLP scholars, actually live this belief out, even when the outside world may believe that they don't have very little, right? I mean, it's to whom much is given, much is expected. And yet I see people every day, women and girls particularly, who are true heroes and giving everything that they have to help others. And I had the privilege in particular of seeing that play out at the Spring and with the other social services agencies that we work with. But it really is something that since I was a little girl was kind of a mantra of my family's. And for me, I think, living this belief was maybe a little bit easier because life was fairly easy for me growing up. My earliest memories of helping to improve my community were actually from Kansas City, and I was probably 6 or 7 years old when I and my sister were tagging along with my mom, who did a lot of volunteer work in the community. And we were at I say WEDU because that's what it is here, but we were at the local PBS station, and I can remember distinctly being asked, my sister and I, probably to keep us from yelling and carrying on at the television station as my mom was helping with their fundraising campaign. They had us coloring posters, and next thing you knew, we were up on air with our sweet little posters saying, support your PBS station, and we love Elmo, or something to that effect. And by the time I think my sister and I were in middle school in Cincinnati, at that point we'd moved from Kansas City to Cincinnati, my sister and I, along with several of our friends, were spending our Saturday mornings as buddies to kids with profound special needs. And we were helping them in the pool because many of them couldn't float on their own and needed assistance, or we were on the gym floor with activities that improved their motor skills, but also just gave them some fun. And I remember how much joy my sister and I and all of our friends had in doing this on Saturday mornings. It made me feel good. It made me feel helpful. And it really sparked my love specifically of working with children and families in need, because families with kids with profound developmental delays or academic delays, that is a tough thing, and it's ever present, and it can be really draining. And so being able to play with these kids, but also give mom a break, was something that I kind of resonated with me and kind of led to some of the career paths I have today. My first job for pay was my last year of high school, when I actually, the summer before I went off to college, I was the waterfront director at Stepping Stones Center for the Handicapped in Cincinnati, and again got to work with that same population of kids and young adults, but as the waterfront director for an entire summer of camp. And I think I look back and I recognize how lucky I was, because I was born into a family with my, more than my fair share of privilege. And so I was able to pick and choose what I wanted to do. Again, because it brought me joy, because it gave me a sense of purpose. And I wasn't really having to worry about the job that I had contributing money to putting food on the table. So, I grew up with the ability to really try things out because they were of interest to me. And I cherish that. As a leader within my friendship circles and my family, and even at the Spring, I try, to remind myself not to take that for granted, and make sure I'm doing my part to make the world a little bit better place. So I went off to college thinking that I was going to become an attorney, and I kind of tend to believe I might have been a good attorney, but I am so glad that I chose a different path, because for me, I think an attorney would have made me narrowly focus, and the path through the nonprofit sector has kind of expanded my thinking and challenged me at every turn. And it's really opened my eyes to so many ways in which the world continues to be unjust for our sisters and brothers all around us. And this brings me to my second leadership observation. Leaders have to keep their eyes open and make sure they are looking beyond their own experience and seeking to understand and honor the many varied, equally important experiences of everyone around them. I probably didn't know I needed to do that as a young person. I grew up, again, in a pretty narrow, insulated world where I lived. But the nonprofit sector gives you such a gift, and it's an opportunity to embrace it and make sure that you're looking around and realizing the world is so much greater than the view that you have, and you have a responsibility to honor that. And I think it's okay that each of us has a worldview that's shaped by our personal experiences, but it's not okay if we refuse to learn about the unique experiences that others have faced and acknowledge those blind spots that we have and ask others to help us fill in those spots with their wisdom. Throughout college, I volunteered. I had leadership roles within student organizations, and I got to do some really cool things using my university's money, which made it even better. one year we used our university's money and didn't make good choices, and then we had no money for the rest of the year to use. But I got to book bands in college. We had a student-run booking service. So James Taylor, Run DMC, REM, Jimmy Buffett were all bands that we literally directly booked. And in some cases, I got to go out to dinner with them or just sit and have a meal with them. So that was a pretty neat experience. I also, in college, got to give historical tours because I was a tour guide at UVA. And I actually got to give a tour. I spent the entire day with Rosa Parks when she came to speak. And took her around, drove her around, showed her Monticello and some other things. And it was just a neat experience to hear her, because she was definitely willing to call me out. So I really loved the experiences I had, but I think the biggest lesson I learned was when I was a worker bee on a crisis hotline. We had something called Open House Hotline. And for 2 years, I staffed the crisis hotline, even though I didn't really feel like I had the skills to do so. And what I learned from that is anybody who knows me, and some of you on this call do, I listen to fix, and I'm always going to listen to fix. But working on the crisis hotline taught me about the importance of sometimes simply being present to listen and to bear witness to people's pain and also to their resilience. And as someone leading a nonprofit where the vast majority of staff have a social work or counseling background, and I do not, I really find myself definitely drawing on my volunteer experience for those 2 years on that crisis hotline to relate to the frontline staff that are doing the work in our agency. And it helps me understand how much more expert they are than I am in doing the work with survivors, and how much I can learn from them if I'm willing to be vulnerable and ask them. Which leads me to leadership observation number 3. Leadership is about being vulnerable, and it's about recognizing that you cannot be the expert on everything in your field or your organization, even if you have a title that sometimes makes people assume you should know it all. And I really struggle with that because I'm the CEO of the Spring, right? So everybody looks to me as the community's expert on domestic violence, but there's so many more people who have a lot more specialized and specific knowledge than I do on domestic violence. So it's about leveraging what I'm good at and leveraging what everyone on my team and what everyone in our community is good at to get the greatest result. And I really think that this observation about being vulnerable has been, no observation has been more true than this and the journey that led me to the Spring. After graduating from college, I moved to Tampa, and I was eventually hired by Liz Kennedy. For those of you who may know Liz, she's a past WLP Symposium honoree, and she became my mentor and essentially my Tampa mom. She was the associate director of what was then known as the Child Abuse Council. It's now Champions for Children. And she hired me to assist with her, with the agency's fundraising efforts. And then 3 months later, she was on a vacation with her husband, David. And I get this sweet little note. So I'm, 3 months into this job, and she tells me that she's retiring and that I'll be just fine on my own as the agency's sole fundraiser. I was 23 and I was terrified. Liz rejoined the agency's board after she got back from vacation and let Paul know that she was also retiring, and proceeded to be my mentor, provide wisdom and support for me that continues to this day. And I really credit her decision to hire me and mentor me as one of the greatest gifts anyone's given me in my life. Which brings me to my 4th leadership observation. Even leaders need leadership. To grow into our roles and to continue evolving, we need to identify people we can connect with who have the wisdom and experience we hope to gain, and allow them to help guide us. And I think when you find those people and they're willing to invest in you, treasure them, because they can be the difference between living your life stream and struggling to find your way. Liz was this person for me, and many others have come after her and have also done this, but I can't understate how important it is. And I will say again, because I'm not an expert, there's all kinds of distinctions between mentors and sponsors, and I could not pretend to tell you that I understand all those distinctions. But what I can tell you is that if you find someone who's in your corner, who's willing to share what they've learned in life and is willing to challenge you when you're being pig-headed, just hold on to them and use what they're giving you. Liz helped me in every way. I figure out what I wanted to do with life and where I wanted to go. She opened all kinds of doors for me and continued to pull me in new directions, even like long after we had a former relationship with the Child Abuse Council. She pulled me onto boards of directors that she was serving on, and really a lot of the experience that I have is because of Liz challenging me and kind of pushing me to be courageous and get out of my comfort zone and do something even when I didn't think I was qualified. And so fast forward to 2012, when the Spring was looking for a CEO, and I stepped into that role, even though at that point I'd been out of the workforce, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, for 13 years. So I had not worked for 13 years. I was raising my son. He happens to have autism, so our little path through life was a little more challenging than some other people's paths. But I've been out of the workforce for 13 years. And to be clear, I did not seek the position at the Spring. It essentially landed at my feet. On the first day that somebody offered it to me, I flat out rejected it and said, because I lacked courage. Again, go back to leadership lesson number 1, you got to be courageous. As the Spring was going through a leadership search for their new CEO, and periodically they would call me because at the time I was the chair of the board of directors of Hillsborough Kids, which was the child welfare agency. And it was a big agency with a lot of staff. And so they were calling me because a lot of the candidates applying to be the CEO at the Spring had experience with Hillsborough Kids. And so as the board chair, they were asking if I knew anything about these candidates. So I would give my advice and go on my merry way. And then finally, one of the board members, Lisa Brock, God bless her, called me one day and said, "Why don't you apply?" And I literally, I laughed. I thanked her for her confidence in me, felt a little flattered, and then basically said no way because I was terrified. The next day I woke up and I said to myself, "This is your dream job, Mindy." And sheepishly called and asked if I could change my mind and put myself forward. So I had to scramble to update a painfully out-of-date resume that was 13 years old. I had to put together a timeline of accomplishments, dust off my interview skills that were a decade old, and show up at the back room. And I think if by any chance, our dear friend Yvonne Fry, fellow WLP members on the call now, I had to show up at the back room of a Cracker Barrel on I-4 for a group interview with 5 board members and the vice president of our agency's biggest fundraiser. Because at the time, Yvonne, who I did not know at all, was the outgoing board chair. And so she was ultimately the person who was guiding the board to make this decision. And the Cracker Barrel is halfway between Plant City, where she lives, and Tampa. So there I was in the back room of a Cracker Barrel, trying my very best to sound polished and professional. So I will say that I would like to think that during that interview, I was practicing all of the things I said about my leadership observations, and I was brilliant. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. I think a lot of it had to do with luck and being at the right place at the right time, and because of all the experiences that I had had as a volunteer and and in work, and all the people I connected with during my first 21 years here in Tampa. So thank you, if you're on the call, Yvonne, for having faith in me. Lisa Brock, some of you probably know, I thank her to this day for being the person who called me and pushed me out of my comfort zone and forced me to be courageous. And I guess the thing that I will lead into now, because this is kind of the meat of why everyone hopefully is here, enough about me, is why should it matter that I'm at the Spring, and why does the Spring matter? I will tell you, I feel called to do this work, and I'm incredibly honored to serve survivors of domestic violence. And we have an absolutely incredible staff and a board of directors and a group of volunteers. And all of us gather together and do this work every day for one reason, and that is because 1 in 4 women, worldwide 1 in 3, will experience domestic violence in their lifetimes. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 3 around the world will experience domestic violence in their lifetimes, and that is unacceptable. And so I'm going to talk to you now about the Spring, and I'm going to talk about domestic violence, and it will be a lot less canned because I got no notes other than what you see in front of you. And what I will say is I'm going to talk about domestic violence through the lens of women, not to minimize that men can experience domestic violence, and we can certainly talk about that in the questions section, but simply to acknowledge that the vast majority of people who experience domestic violence are women. So I'm going to use gendered language. It is a gendered issue. I know sometimes, people get frustrated by that. I don't think necessarily maybe this group will, but I just like to say that off the top of my head. And I think it's important to start with the legal definitions in Florida statute, because there are really two definitions of domestic violence. And one is this definition that addresses the ways in which you can be arrested if you perpetrate domestic violence. So it's around assault and aggravated assault and battery, and sexual assault and sexual battery and stalking, all of the things you see on here, by one household member or family member against another household or family member. So these are the ways in which you can perpetrate the crime of domestic violence, and as a perpetrator be arrested, and as a victim have some law enforcement remedies. But there's a broader definition of domestic violence, and we refer to it as the working definition. And here you see that domestic violence is a pattern of controlling behaviors, violence or threats of violence, that one person uses to establish power and control over an intimate partner in order to control that partner's actions and activities. And I really think it's important that we understand that working definition, that it's a pattern of controlling behaviors, and it's about power and control by one partner over their intimate partner. And it's a choice, and we'll talk about that in a second. I also think that if you know anything about domestic violence, or you've watched any of the made-for-television movies or read a book, you will hear about the cycle of violence. And we still talk about it and use it because for many survivors, it does describe their experience. And the cycle of violence is that idea that violence, that a batterer can be sweet and be all candy and boxes of chocolates and flowers in what's known as the honeymoon phase. And then as the batterer escalates into violence and the violence erupts, right, then and the survivor begins walking on eggshells, and the violence erupts. Then once the violence erupts, typically the batterer is very apologetic, says it's never going to happen again, and goes back into that honeymoon phase. And so it's that cycle. And while the cycle is one way of framing it, I'd also like to kind of suggest that maybe a more accurate depiction, because over time with domestic violence, as it increases and as it goes longer, that cycle, the honeymoon phase over time will disappear. And so really a campaign of terror is the way that we like to frame it, because with a survivor of domestic violence who's in partnership with a batterer, the batterer's ever-present tactics of abuse, while not always physical, not always violent, what is ever present in the relationship is this idea that something bad could happen to me as the victim. And it's that constant campaign that the batterer has using a variety of tactics that's designed to keep her under control, and to keep her cautious, and to keep her walking on eggshells so that she'll do whatever he says. So there's two ways to describe it. I just want to share both of those with you. And if anybody has any questions at any point in time, feel free. I mean, I don't have to go all the way through this. So if you have a question, feel free to stop me. Jessica is the person who's watching. I just want to say, who is at risk? Everyone, right? No matter your age, race, religion, culture, ethnicity, whether you're male, female, your orientation, your gender identity, or economic status, anyone can be a victim of abuse. And while, there are certainly, if you are poor, abuse is harder because you have the overlay of all the challenges of poverty, with also abuse and maybe fewer tools at your disposal. The reality is that abuse is occurring with just as great frequency in wealthy neighborhoods as it is in poor neighborhoods, and across cultures and races and ethnicities. So domestic violence does not discriminate. And so we at the Spring, we're here to serve everyone. Abuse, again, is a choice. I talked about that kind of briefly at the beginning, but I want to really reinforce that. A lot of times the language that we use around abuse frames it as if the batterer has lost control. He has an anger management problem, or he has a substance abuse problem. So he's drinking too much, or he's using drugs, or he's lost his job. And so there are all these ways in which we want to minimize the idea that abuse is a choice, that we do this as a society. And the reality is, while alcohol abuse, misuse, drug use, losing your job, those all can add stress into a family and into the abuser's life. That stress doesn't there's a whole bunch of people who are experiencing those stressors. There's a whole bunch of people with alcohol problems who would never harm a fly. So while it may increase the rate of violence or exacerbate it, it is not the cause. Abuse is a choice, and it's a choice because the batterer thinks that if I do these tactics, I can control my partner. And it's a choice because it often works. And if you have any struggles in understanding that it's a choice, I want to challenge you to think about the batterer picks, who he's going to abuse, right? And it's typically his partner and kids, unless he has an anger management problem and gets into bar fights too. He's not beating up, his business partner. He's not beating up his golf buddies. He's picking on his partner and his kids. He's choosing the time that he does it, right? She's about to go off to work, and everything is starting out to be a good day, and he batters her right before work with the idea of disrupting her ability to be successful in work, because if she loses her job, she becomes more isolated and he has more control. He chooses how each time he batters. Is he going to verbally abuse her? Is he going to emotionally abuse her? Is he going to physically abuse her? Is he going to sexually assault her? He chooses how much. Is it going to be an hour? Is it going to be all weekend? He chooses where. And the example is in the driveway of the family's house, but where can also be, where is he physically going to hit her? And we see an awful lot of injuries. Women's breasts are targeted, their bellies are targeted, their buttocks are targeted, places that are covered in general when you're out in public by clothing, because a lot of batterers have a whole different perception in the community. They might be the guy who helps you fix your tire because he's the nice neighbor down the street who helped you fix your tire when you had a flat. So they're battering in places where their abuse isn't going to be seen because they have an image that they want to protect of themselves as being a good guy. And then he decides who's going to witness, whether it'll just be the wife or partner, or whether it's going to be the kids or another family member. And I also want to point this out on this slide, that a lot of times people talk about an abuse victim, that she must have low self-esteem. And I would say there are an awful lot of really incredible women that I know who lead companies, who are successful in life, who have great self-esteem, but pick the wrong guy to date. And these guys are like con men, and they're very good at what they do. And they don't start out abusive from the get-go. And when they do start their abuse, it's often, begins with verbal and emotional abuse. They're not punching somebody on their first date. And at the very same time that they're doing this, they're also minimizing what's happening. So they're making a disparaging comment. You're ugly, you're fat, your food is bad. And then they're following up when she calls them out and saying, oh, babe, you misunderstood me. Oh, you're really making a mountain out of a molehill. And so it's this constant give and take of really being told what you perceive to be happening in the relationship really isn't. And if it is, it's your fault. I wouldn't have done that to you if you didn't burn the toast. And so over time, that layering effect may lead to self-esteem, but I would argue that an awful lot of people don't start with poor self-esteem. So battering, again, is solely the responsibility of the batterer and not the victim. This is the power and control wheel. And I'll make sure that maybe we can distribute it from the presentation, or just distribute the presentation too. But I have found that sometimes the best way, if you know somebody who is experiencing an unhealthy relationship and you don't know what to do, if it's safe to do so, even if it means you go out and get a cup of coffee and you let her look at it, but don't have her take it home if it's dangerous to do so, just sharing the power and control wheel sometimes is all a survivor needs to finally begin to understand that the abuse is not her fault, because this power and control wheel encompasses all the ways in which batterers control their partners. And it's amazing. You will see women just literally start to cry because they've never seen one page that really sums up what's happening to them in their relationship. So, you know, as you can see, at the center is power and control, and on the outside is the physical and sexual violence. And, you know, some batterers may only physically assault their partner one time, and only one time, but it might have been pretty violent. They might have broken an arm, or they might have really, you know, given black eyes. And all they have to do is remind their partner, remember last September. So they don't have to use violence or sexual assault all the time. They can just allude to it, which is why it's kind of on the outside, because sometimes it's ever present, and other times it's just the threat. And so using coercion and threats, economic abuse, using children, it's very hard when you have children in common, the ways in which children are used as tools. And the idea that you need to protect your children is ever present with survivors of domestic violence, because abusers can be incredibly cruel with their children. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, intimidation, coercion, and threats. We see every week people reporting to us, he discharged his weapon in my presence. He threatened to strangle me. He threatened to kill himself. There's so many ways in which control is exerted by batterers.
And Mindy, we have a question.
Sure.
This is from Liana. She says,
Okay.
have reports of abuse increased or decreased while everyone is at home and abusers are not leaving the home as often?
So it's been very interesting. The state attorney and I did a joint press release to a campaign to say we are open, because in the months of March and April, in particular, law enforcement assistance was down dramatically, as were injunctions overall, for injunctions for protection being filed in court. What we found is that the spring's calls maintained. So we maintained, we had as many calls this year as we did last year. We didn't see an increase. But what we found kind of anecdotally is as restrictions were starting to be lifted, we started getting more and more calls from survivors who were saying this, I've needed to call for 3 weeks, but this is the first time I was able to do so. And we had a very empty shelter for a while. And now, we're still not full, but we're kind of creeping back up. So it's been really interesting. It's following kind of what we're hearing from around the world, which is when we were most severely constricted, calls were down, requests for service were down, because survivors, he was sitting across the sofa from them and they couldn't call. But now those restrictions are being lifted. We're seeing an increase. And in fact, we opened 100 new client files last month in May for our injunction for protection attorneys. We have 7 full-time attorneys who do nothing but provide legal assistance around injunctions, free of charge, regardless of income, and 112 new clients in the month of May. Which is, a little bit higher than normal. Normally we're somewhere around 80 to 90. So, so there's a lot of people seeking legal remedies. And I think, Liana, it'll be a little bit more time before we really know, what that trajectory looks like. But we see it creeping up, both locally and around the state. As I've been talking, you've been able to also read the national stats. They're just, again, awful. And you can see kind of the rate at which women are impacted versus men and adolescent girls. I mean, domestic violence, teen dating violence is occurring with little girls as young as 11 or 12 years old. So it's really important as parents that we have those conversations with our kids. I want to talk briefly about language and domestic violence, and just acknowledge that one way we can play our role is to really be cognizant of the ways in which we frame this issue. If you look in the media, and even I would say a lot of women, right? A lot of my women friends, and I myself, perhaps in my younger days, might have to admit that I might have been a little judgy. I was all in for child abuse when I was a youngster and young adult, but maybe didn't understand domestic violence, right? And so the question, I'm sure I asked, I'm sure I'm going to acknowledge this, but I was asking, why doesn't she just leave? If this happened to me, I would leave. What is she doing that makes him act that way? I never said that, but I'm sure I asked the why doesn't she just leave question. What is wrong with her? And then, back in the day, in the child welfare system, there was literally a maltreatment in child welfare called failure to protect. They've now renamed it family violence threatened child. But either way, failure to protect was squarely on mom. you know, because typically it's mom, you know, dad who was abusing, or the paramour. But even family violence threatens child, as if the family is violent, as opposed to there's one person in that family who is causing all the violence against the partner, the other partner, and against the children, or threatening the children. So I think that those questions are so dangerous, because they put the burden and they blame on the survivor, right? That it's her fault, when we could just as easily be asking, why is he allowed to batter her? Why are we as a society letting him get away with it? Why isn't he, you know, getting a prison term if he's, you know, shot her and she lived, or if he stabbed her and she lived? You know, why is he getting away with it? And then the other thing I would say is, you know, why is just leave not the answer? There's a whole bunch of reasons. You know, domestic violence is embarrassing. It's hard to admit that it's happening to you. It shouldn't be embarrassing for the survivor, but it still is in our society. You know, there's a fear about loss of financial, you know, means, and we get real judgy about that too. Well, she just wants to stay for the money. The reality is, if you're trying to choose between leaving and, you know, having a safe place to lay your head, at least physically safe place to lay your head, and food on the table for your kids, or, you know, potentially living in your car, coming to the communal living environment that is our shelter, you know, that's a hard choice to make. And frankly, sometimes, you know, you don't leave because you love him. I mean, there's a reason you fell in love with him, and you can't just turn off love, even if he's being abusive. What you're wanting is for the abuse to stop and the good part of him to reemerge. And it can take some time to figure out that maybe that good part is not going to ever emerge in the way that you want it to. So here are some of the other reasons. Culture and religion play a part. There are some religions that do a really good job of supporting survivors when they announce that they're being abused, and there are others that don't. And going against your culture or your religion, you know, can be really isolating. So, and again, if you are pregnant or you have children in common, leaving is risky, and it's hard to do. And it's not a clean break, especially if you have a child. You will never be free from them until, you know, even when that child's grown, you may not be fully free. Biggest barrier for Hillsborough County, for you all to be aware of, is, you know, leaving also means you have to find out where you're going to go next, and there is nowhere to go. If you are not wealthy, there is a huge lack of affordable housing. The barriers into getting into the few affordable housing units we do have, you know, if you have an eviction or a criminal history, it's very hard to get a landlord to overlook those things. If you have a disability, you might be able to get into affordable housing, because there are some set aside for folks with various disabilities. So if you don't have a disability, that, you know, you can't use that to get into affordable housing. And if you're not chronically homeless, so there's a lot more affordable housing or permanent housing units that are being put into place for chronically homeless folks than there are for people who are episodically homeless because of domestic violence. And there really just frankly aren't enough emergency shelter beds, independent of the spring itself, just emergency shelter beds in general for women with kids. We don't have enough of them. And so those are some of the reasons why, you know, people don't leave. So what do we do at the spring in like 5 minutes or less, so that we have time for questions? So as you see, safety, safety, safety. The mission of the spring is to prevent domestic violence, protect victims, and promote change in lives, families, and communities. That's been our mission, and it kind of encompasses everything we do. And we do a lot more, I think, than people think we do. So we were founded in 1977. We're among the largest of Florida's 41 certified domestic violence centers. And that's a picture of actually our peaceful little bucolic playground that's attached to our school. Taken with my iPhone, so not the greatest picture, but it does show you that it's, you know, it's actually a nice place. There's some really beautiful aspects of our facility. We have a 24-hour crisis hotline that we've operated forever and a day. The phone number is super easy to remember, 813-24/7-SAFE. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we're here to help you. Our emergency residential shelter, that's one of the bedrooms, and then one of the residential hallways in our new building. So we have a 128-bed residential facility. That is right now more like a 70-bed residential facility because of COVID-19 and social distancing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But we provide safety and supportive services designed around a 6-week emergency stay. Sometimes, though, people will need a little bit longer, as much as 3 or 4 months. Sometimes people stay in our emergency shelter. We have outreach services, and I don't think people realize that we actually serve twice as many adults outside of shelter as we do inside. So last year we served about 1,100 women and men and kids, and we shelter men as well, probably anywhere from 5 to 15 depending on the year. But in emergency shelter, almost half the people who live with us are kiddos. So typically around 500 to 550 children live with us during the course of the year. And about 550 to 600 adults live with us. But outside of shelter, in our outreach services centers in Tampa and Plant City, we actually serve about 1,400 survivors with direct face-to-face service. And you can receive all of the services in outreach that you would receive in shelter, with the exception of shelter itself. And sometimes people will start an outreach because they're not ready to leave the relationship, but they're seeking help to do so safely, or they're seeking ways to be safer while they're making decisions. And then they might eventually start an outreach and head to shelter next. We also have our Peace Village apartment complex. So that's one of our apartments in the playground at the apartment. So it's a 12-unit apartment complex up in the USF area. And it's affordable housing, very low barrier, affordable housing for 12 survivors and their children. So it's 12 apartments and kiddos, so moms and kids who live there for up to 12 months while they're getting their life back together after abuse. A lot of times they're working on a degree, maybe a 2-year degree, sometimes a 4-year degree, sometimes a graduate degree, or they're in a job training program, or they're just working in their job and trying to save money so that they can be economically self-sufficient. We have an incredible kids program. We were the first domestic violence center in the United States to have an on-site school. For over 25 years, we partnered with Hillsborough County Public Schools so that kids have a safe option to go to school on-site with us. And that pivots, we've got a daycare, and then that pivots in the summer to summer camp within that program. We also have prevention and education programs in the schools. So we have 2 staff who do nothing but teach. They do the like a 6-week instruction program in high schools. They do one and done presentations in schools, and then they do a teen summit. And those are some of the high school kids that put on the annual teen summit for about 200 kids at UACDC, which is in the USF area, so the University Area Community Development Corporation. And it's a really cool all-day summit talking about healthy relationships. We have a health and wellness program. This is our new building, so I wish I could blow up that picture because it's like, here's the prettiest part of shelter. But in 2015, we built a new building, Nunley Farrier House, and there's a multi-purpose room on the first floor where we do yoga. We have instructors doing Zumba. I think that's what she was doing with our families. And it's part of our health and wellness program. We also, the health and wellness staff person also talks to healthcare professionals and does lots of training on how they can be supportive to survivors. And then we have our Shelter University group that includes about 400 classes we do a year, mostly in that first floor we configure for the classes. And our signature classes are Bridges Out of Poverty, really helping people understand the hidden rules of class and how they can learn the skills they need to become more financially independent in life. And then we have our 7 attorneys who work full-time on the spring staff. We have a partnership with law enforcement for high-risk cases where they actually read all of the calls for law enforcement service. And special programs with the child welfare system, I think, as I mentioned, and a pet program to house pets of families entering shelter. So COVID-19 has affected our services in a few ways. As I mentioned, I think earlier, survivors are more afraid of COVID than of their abuser. And so we've had survivors call talking about being strangled or being threatened with a gun. And we're really concerned for their safety, but they're still more afraid of COVID. And so, you know, we really work that with them and recognize and honor the decision they're making and make sure that we do as much safety planning on the phone as we can. As I mentioned, we've got a lot more survivors are exploring legal remedies. I think when your options are more limited because of social distancing and the constraints of COVID-19 and the pandemic, I think you look for the highest possible service you can get to make yourself safe. And so for a lot of survivors, the idea is I want to get him out of my house. It's my house or it's my apartment. I own the lease. I want to get him out. So I'm going to work with an attorney to do so. outreach. We're using Zoom. So I don't know how much y'all know about social services people, but we are we just do not like technology, and we are so slow to embrace technology and so skeptical about technology being effective, right? I think doctors were the same, and they're all saying this is, these telemedicine, it's the greatest thing since sliced ham. Well, we're kind of finding that with Zoom. We've got the fancy Zoom that we bought to make sure that it's HIPAA compliant, and we're actually doing one-on-one supportive counseling and group our support groups on Zoom now. I'm doing a lot of trainings on Zoom, a lot of trainings with survivors, a lot of trainings with the public, a lot of trainings with law enforcement. And we're going to be adding text and chat to our very archaic telephone hotline services, right? Nobody wants to talk on a hotline, especially if you're young, that you want to chat or do text or chat. And so we're chat and text enabling our hotline, and we're going to be moving in that direction as well. And then the one thing I would say is I've literally never cleaned so much in my life. And I would say every single person who works in shelter or in outreach is going to say the same thing, because it's just constant cleaning to make sure that we don't spread COVID-19. We don't want to be a vector. We've had one positive case, and it was one staff member, and it did not result in anyone else. And so we're really trying hard to make sure that that happens. I would just say, kind of as I wrap up my slides in closing, to give a few minutes for questions, ways that you can help. I've already acknowledged some of this, but I think the biggest thing you do for a survivor is believe her, right? Believe what she tells you. There are all these messages around domestic violence and around sexual assault where the script is flipped. So I don't think any of us would ever question if somebody says, man, last week you will never believe what happened to me. I was walking down the street and somebody came up with a baseball bat and they hit me on the head and they mugged me and they took my wallet. We would not start questioning that story and say, I don't know. Are you sure? Maybe it was an accident. Did they really mean to hit you? Maybe they picked up your wallet because they thought, you dropped it and they were going to give it to you. We would never question other crimes. But for some reason, when it comes to sexual assault and it comes to domestic violence, somebody tells you what happens, and then we immediately go to, oh, she might be lying. There's not as much research in domestic violence, but there's a whole bunch of research in sexual assault that looks at the rate of false accusations. And the research, depending on the university, has been as few as like 3%. And as high as 10% rates of false accusations, and it converges at about 7%, which means 93% of the time, at minimum, because there's some belief that even that's too high, but 93% of the time, somebody who's telling you that they've been raped is telling the truth. And yet I would say that probably we're only believing them 7% of the time. So start with belief. I know that's probably not for us, but just society at large. Believe her. And support her. Even if you are finding it far-fetched because you know her partner and he seems like the nicest guy on the planet, believe her, because it takes a lot of courage to say what's going on in your life. Support her, educate her, let her know that the spring exists, that the services are free, that she doesn't have to come into shelter if she wants to get services, that there are attorneys on staff that can help her free of charge, even if she has $5 million in the bank. Acknowledge that it's not fair what's happening to her. Do not blame her. And then really importantly, point out her strengths, because he's already telling her she's stupid. No one else is ever going to want her. She's fat. She's a bad cook. She's a bad cleaner. She's an awful mom. Your kids, our kids hate you. He's telling her those messages every day. So if you can start pointing out her strengths, you are so kind. I can't believe how patient you are with your kids. Kids can be such, kids can really try our last nerve, and look at how patient you were when little Johnny needed help with his schoolwork. I've never met a friend who's so supportive as you. Point out her strengths and remind her all the ways in which she's good, because that's what she's going to draw on when she's finally ready to leave. She's going to start remembering the messages that you're giving her that are counteracting the messages that he's giving her. Be a media critic. I don't post a lot on social media, and if I paid too much attention to social media, then I would get nothing else done. And so thank goodness we've got really good people on staff who do a lot of our posting. But occasionally I will post something on my personal page, and I think the greatest interaction I've ever had has been the few times that I've posted about a headline from the newspaper. and the way in which, you know, a survivor was murdered, so a victim was murdered, and the way the media framed it. There's one I think of a couple years ago that happened in Tampa where a man killed his partner, and then the reason he didn't kill himself, so he was there to say why he did it, and the reason he gave is that, you know, she wasn't giving him the remote control to the television fast enough. And the only reason I know that is because that was the part of the headline, you know, man kills, you know, wife over you know, remote control. We're giving him power to say why he did something, and it's ridiculous. There is no excuse for murder, and yet so often we're validating his flawed beliefs. So be a media critic. Call out the media when they do silly things like that. That's not even really particularly bad. There's some that have been much more worse. And also use social media to applaud when somebody does something unexpectedly good. Be careful with your language. Link her with our services. Educate yourself and know resources. Be culturally aware and you know, be an upstander. There's a lot of ways you can offer help that don't put you at risk and don't put her at risk. So I will take questions. I put one of my favorite quotes on there just to close with some happiness. Look closely at the present you are constructing. It should look like the future you are dreaming. So thank you so much. I think we have maybe 10 minutes if there are some more questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mindy.
Yeah, and I can see no one, so I'm talking to my screen.
If you want to unshare your screen, that might, I don't know how many people have their cameras on right now.
All right.
Is that Trimika?
Oh, look, I can see a couple people. Well, nope.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay, Molly, go ahead. And then Trimika, you'll be next.
And it was too long to type. I started to type it, my thumbs hurt. First of all, we love you, Mindy. It is such an honor to have you as a friend and leader. Our community is so lucky. The women and children in our region are so lucky for your compassion and care. And I just feel very honored to see you in action and know you.
Thank you.
And my question is kind of loaded, but we're on the precipice of what I hope is some real change around the racial disparities and systemic racism in our country. And I was thinking, gosh, it's been a very painful journey and there's a long way to go. When you think about the journey of women and domestic violence, what if there was some wand you could wave? And we talked a little bit about this, like teaching from a very young age what healthy relationships are, empowering women, some of these things. But I'm just curious if you have any vision toward where we could go to see real change happen with domestic violence.
Yeah, you know, I find it so you're right, that's a big question. And I don't have a real good answer because what I would start by saying is that women get things done, right? And women solve problems. And for over 40 years, women have been trying to solve this problem. And so if it was going to be solved by women, we would have solved it. I think the challenge is, and I draw heavily on my friend Jackson Katz, and we brought him down to Tampa a couple times. But Jackson Katz frames domestic violence. It's not a women's issue. It's a men's issue, right? And again, doesn't discount the fact that there are women who perpetrate, but there's this many women who perpetrate, and there's this many men, you can't even see my hands anymore, who perpetrate. And if men would own this as a women's issue, as a men's issue, and take responsibility for changing the way in which we condition boys to become men, we would see a decrease over time in domestic violence. So I think this single greatest thing we can do is to try and raise our boys and to try and engage our men who we love and care about in owning this as their issue, because they're the ones who are actually going to be able to change it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I really think that is actually the key challenge is that we're trying to solve something that's happening to us, but we're not the ones causing it to happen to us by and large.
Excellent. Thank you, Mindy. First, I want to see, I think Trimika said something in the chat. So if Trimika, you want to turn your microphone on, you can.
Oh, my people are here.
One of the things that I noticed in media is their choice of words when domestic violence has taken place. So someone has been killed rather than someone was murdered, or someone was choked instead of someone was strangled, you know, or either they, to your point earlier, they provide, you know, reasons because of the remote control. You know, what is our role? What is the duty that we have to be able to call the media out on those types of statements?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a balancing act of, you know, I do ascribe to you catch more flies with honey than, you know, vinegar. But you have to figure out the time when you want to really throw the kind of the gauntlet down. And I think there's a way that you can call out each and every time when you see it, and have conversations with other people to point out. But I mean, I've gone and actually posted or written a message to especially if I know them, like local media. You know, I've just written kind of a sweet message saying, hey, you know, I don't know if you really thought about how this came across, and have had some really, really good conversations. But I think language is really powerful. And I've been so impressed. Molly actually framed it. The thing that I really, really, really gives me a little bit of hope is the way in which very quickly the media, for the most part, pivoted to naming what happened to George Floyd as a murder, right? It's, you know, it doesn't matter that it was law enforcement, it was a murder. And being very intentional about saying George Floyd's murder, not his death, has been a sea change. And I would like to see that sea change across a lot of social injustice. But I think, so that gets back to the idea too of applauding the people, you know, taking a moment. Also, you're calling out, also try and find ways where you can applaud somebody. Thank you so much for, you know, naming this correctly. You're helping, you know, keep it from happening to the next person.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Susan, did you want to say something?
Okay. Speech was great, by the way. But I've been listening to these same themes for many years. I just wanted to ask you what happened with your fundraising through this pandemic?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's been very interesting. We have two signature fundraising events. So I'm going to separate by fundraising events and by general fundraising. So our spring event, Handbags and Happy Hour, which was going to be the most fantastic handbags and happy hour that has ever existed, which was going to be one of the best events ever in Tampa in April, is going to be in April of 2021, which will give us time to find even more amazing handbags, right? So we basically just flat out postponed it. First, we moved it to September, and then we said nobody's going to want to we don't want to socially gather, you know, in droves of 500. But also our other signature fundraiser in the fall in October, our Gift of Peace lunch, we have also said there's no way we're going to gather, and the convention center has been very helpful. So that'll be in October of 2021 as well. We are going to try and do a non-traditional Gift of Peace, not a like virtual everybody, you know, raise a glass. Number one, it's a luncheon, but we're going to try and make it a very personalized experience. I don't want to have this drink known as the ladies who drink at, you know, lunchtime. So that's been, you know, a challenge because that's a couple $100,000 in lost revenue. But we have had some incredible donors, a couple of whom are board members, step up and make leadership gifts. One gave us a $75,000 gift. One gave us a $50,000 gift. One gave us a $100,000 gift. So surprisingly, we've had some really good fundraising, which I am not. So we're going to actually have probably our best year ever in recent memory because our fiscal year ends.
So I don't need to give you any money
this
year.
But here's the challenge is that the fundraising is going to have to sustain us for the next 18 to 24 months. Because I truly believe that there's going to be a decline in giving as the economic realities, not across everyone. I think there's plenty of pockets that are still going to be wealthy, but we're really trying to hold on to that cash to kind of play it out for a longer period of time. And frankly, I mean, we do have to cover both those fundraisers for this year. And our thrift store has been closed since March. We still haven't reopened. Just because the government says it's okay to reopen doesn't necessarily mean that it actually is. So we still have our stores closed. So we're losing about 40 grand a month in and net over expense. So or 20 grand a month. So we'll have lost about 60,000 from that operation by the time we reopen. So but I still feel we're okay. But if you want to give us a gift, Susan, I'm not going to say no.
Okay.
Ask me in 6 months, because I think we'll have a better sense of what it's going to look like.
Okay.
Excellent. Does anyone have any other questions before we wrap up this evening? If you don't want to say it out loud, you can put it in the chat. Or even just a pat on the back for thanking Mindy so much for being here.
Oh, well, I thank you guys for giving up an hour to listen to me. That means a lot.
We love to listen to you, Mindy.
Thank you.
Amazing job.
Thanks.
Oh, we thank you all. And Mindy, as I said earlier, thank you for the good that you do in so many ways. It's just amazing to be in your orbit.
Oh, well, thank
You're
you.
a blessing.
Thank you. You all are a blessing to me. So I really appreciate it. And so thank you for being with me in my moment of courage. Because, all right. Well, good to see you. Bye,
Well,
Lauren.
so good to see
Bye.
so many
Bye.
people.
Bye.
Bye.